Welcome to the Comedy Reset Spotlight. This is the place to be if you want to hear from some of the most innovative and exciting comedy creators from around the globe. On this podcast, you'll hear from a variety of guests who are pushing the boundaries of what comedy can be. If you're looking for fresh perspectives and new ideas, this is the podcast for you.
Episode 30. New York City comedian Kristen Romney.
Can you walk us through the moment or series of events that made you realize you wanted to pursue stand-up comedy?
Anybody who has had learning disabilities will tell you that when you're a kid, you sometimes wonder if you can be good at anything because of how hard school is. And one thing I knew, despite my having struggled in school for so many years, one thing I knew is I was very good at making people laugh. I would constantly be making my friends and family laugh, and it was something I really enjoyed. And a couple years before I started doing stand-up, I would go to a lot of stand-up comedy shows to get like inspiration, and I would just know like this I think I could be really good at. And I in 2019 I took my first stand-up comedy class, and that got me onto my first show. And then I did several shows in that year. Then obviously in 2020, everything shut down. And it was almost like it took a global crisis to get us all to realize how good we had it. Because it wasn't really until 2020 when I wasn't able to do stand-up anymore where I just could not stop thinking about it, and I just could not stop hoping for the day I'll be able to get back on that stage. And then when things reopened, I knew I was not going to waste any more time not doing what I love. And I have turned all the struggles I had growing up and everything that I thought was so challenging into a really humorous routine that I'm very, very proud of.
Who were your comedic inspirations growing up, and how have they influenced your style or approach to comedy?
When I was a kid, I was not really watching comedians. I was just really into sitcoms. I loved sitcoms, and I would constantly see, how the character delivered a certain line. So like, for instance, Full House, I thought was really good sitcom because every character was really, really funny, but in their own way. Friends is another example. Every character is really, really great and have a lot of really great lines, but deliver them in their own specific way. And after I started doing stand-up, that's really when I started analyzing comedians and really getting into watching how comedians do their thing. And I would say, as of now, my biggest comedic inspiration is Taylor Tomlinson. And I just love how she will turn anything that we're all thinking, will turn anything it's very relatable. Like, we all have experienced it. We all know what she's talking about, and she'll take it to the next level where she'll explain it in just the funniest way where I'm almost like, wow, I wish I had thought of that. And I just love her confidence on stage, and it really has been very inspirational for me as of now as a comedian.
Describe the very first time you stepped onto a stage to perform stand-up. What was going through your mind, and how did that experience shape your subsequent performances?
I remember that first show so well. It was June 13th, 2019. And I remember I had my whole script because when I started out, I just had to write everything down of how exactly I was going to say it. I don't have to do that anymore. Now I just write some bullet points and I just practice how I'll say it. But when I started out, I had to write out a script. And I remember the night before trying to memorize it. And it was so hard. I'm like, I can't memorize how I'm going to do this. But then I stopped thinking of it in terms of a script and started thinking of it in terms of conversation, where I was telling a story that I wrote out. It was all scripted, but I was thinking in terms of, okay, imagine I'm just telling someone the story. And that helped me remember my quote unquote lines so much better. And I remember I was so nervous going into that first show. And in fact, I only invited my parents and a longtime friend because I was too nervous to tell people about the show. I was like, oh God, if a lot of people are there and I don't do well, it's going to be awful. So I kept the audience very small. And when I got up there and people were really laughing at every beat, and then as soon as I got off, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. I want to keep doing this. And that's when really where I felt like I found my niche. And and that was a big transformation from before I took my stand-up class, because when I just went to my first open mic, I didn't know how to tell any jokes. I didn't know how to tell, the story in a comedic way, and it didn't go well. But then after I had some coaching through the class, I just felt like I really hit my stride, and I'll always remember that thrilling moment of receiving the feedback in terms of really strong audience laughter.
Comedy is an evolving art form. How have you seen your own comedic style change and mature over the years?
That's a very interesting question, because I actually talk to other comedians about this a lot, about watching your sets from a couple years ago and just seeing the evolution. Because in my first year of comedy, there were some jokes where I just absolutely like crushed with those lines. Like people were howling. It was the best jokes. And now I look back at those jokes and I'm like, really? That was my big zinger? And I also feel like, it's very important to tape all your sets, not just to, see how you could improve, which is, of course, extremely, extremely important. But it's interesting to watch even sets from a few months ago, because you might not realize the evolution of your comedic style. You might not realize how you've grown as a comedian. But I've sometimes done like open mics or shows with people who have seen me perform for like, a year and a half, and they'll tell me, wow, you're really improving, or wow, you've grown so much. And I don't even notice that, but I love it, and I feel like just with anything, it is, it it's something you just keep getting better at. Like you can never be a perfect stand-up comedian. There's always room for improvement here or there. It's like anything. It's like with acting or with art or anything. And so I guess I just really feel like I started off just telling like little jokes and making people laugh and then just elevated my the way I would tell the jokes and made it more like professional as opposed to almost like open mic style. So it's just, I feel like it feels really good to watch the evolution of your own stuff.
Can you share a particularly challenging gig or phase in your early career? And what lessons did you take away from it?
So after the pandemic shut everything down, when things reopened again, and I got back on stage and started performing at shows again, I definitely could tell that I got very, very rusty because I was out of practice. And like I would sometimes be laughing at my own jokes, or I will not hit it as hard as I would like to. And And I feel like probably the first several months to a year after I started doing stand up again, I just felt like, this isn't really like as thrilling as it used to be, because I think it's because I wasn't getting the same audience feedback as I used to. And it's because I was out of practice and I just kind of wanted to jump in the deep end a little bit, where instead of building back up to doing shows, I would just book all these shows. And so I took a few months off from doing shows and just focused on honing my craft and just focused on working on elevating my material. And then at the beginning of 2023, that's when I started doing a lot of shows again. And that's when I really started getting that thrill that I missed so much. And that's when I started like really loving stand-up comedy again. And now it's really all I want to do. And I would say that's probably, it's not really one specific gig, but it's more of um, you know writing your own jokes and not having had the practice to really make those jokes hit, and then sometimes just be telling a joke that it's like crickets, no one laughs, and that's always a really horrible feeling as a comedian.
How do you handle the inevitable bombing on stage? And what strategies do you employ to bounce back?
Bombing on stage is awful, especially when it was a joke you're really proud of, and also when it's a joke that normally does very well. You bring jokes that do very well to a big show, thinking, "Oh my God, this is going to be awesome," and then they don't laugh at that particular joke, and then it's just awful because you kind of want to explain to the booker, like, "No, no, no, that joke normally does very well, I promise." And also, if you're looking to get a really good tape, that's always awful too, because tapes are not good if there's not a lot of laughter. The jokes could be funny, but if there's not laughter, it's like when you're watching a sitcom. Like, there has to be laughter in order to really make it feel like, oh, those were really good jokes. And so what I have gotten to do is I might make a joke about not having received the laughter. So if there's a joke that maybe the audience just needs a few seconds to process, or maybe if I'm doing a show where there's a 2-drink minimum, I might just make a joke about that. Like, after I tell the joke and people are not getting right away, I might say, "It's okay, I know there's a 2-drink minimum, I'll give you guys a second." And or something like that. That's not the only thing I would say, but I might make a joke about that. Or at open mics, when I'm trying new stuff at open mics, inevitably there's going to be jokes that just don't land because you're doing open mic. You're just practicing new stuff. I might look at my notes and say, "Okay, how else can I make everybody uncomfortable today?" And people laugh at that. So I think if you just kind of laugh at yourself a little bit and just kind of make jokes about how your jokes are not doing well, it really gets people kind of on your side instead of getting all flustered, because that's happened to me before, where jokes aren't landing and I get all flustered, and now I lose without my train of thought. I forget what I was going to say. And so I guess that's really how I handle it, is I kind of learn to bounce back from it, just kind of like let it roll off, maybe make jokes about how your jokes are not doing well, or maybe one time I actually just turned to crowd work. I was like, okay, this set is not working. Instead of making it more awkward, I'm just going to turn to crowd work, and then you engage with the crowd and they start to really like you, and then they start laughing at your stuff more. That's kind of how I've done it personally.
Walk us through your process of creating a new joke or bit. Do you start with a premise, a punchline, or something else entirely?
It depends. Often, if I get inspiration from something, like I have jokes about museums, and it came to me when I was at a museum. So I would be writing it down while I'm at the museum so I don't forget it. I have jokes about staying at Airbnbs, and that came to me when I was at an Airbnb. Same thing, I write it down so when I get back on stage, I'll remember it. And sometimes there might just be something that just really annoys me. Like, I have a routine about, subways, or about the very slow pedestrian traffic in Times Square, or just stuff that really angers you, that probably angers a lot of people. And if it's very relatable, I might just start talking about it. Sometimes I might just start venting on stage. I'll be like, okay, guys, I just want to vent about biographies, or I just want to vent about subways. And you just start venting, and then sometimes people will laugh as you're venting, and that's when you're like, oh, that's funny, I should use that. And then sometimes there might just be a punchline where I'm like, you know what? I really like this concept. I just don't know how to turn it into a routine yet. Or I really like this line. I think this line is very funny. I just need to figure out how to get to that line. And because sometimes you tell a joke and the punchline gets last, but the setup doesn't, or vice versa. And so that's kind of my personal process. And then sometimes I might just want to write about stories that happened to me, like something that happened when I was a child, or something that happened a few years ago, or and there might be something funny in that story. And sometimes, honestly, I don't even realize that something is funny until I tell it to someone, because sometimes I'll be telling someone a story, like I'll say, one time a few years ago, this, and they're laughing, and they're like, that is so funny. And I'm like, you know what? I didn't even realize that was funny. And so that's another way I get some of my material. Like, I've had a lot of times when I would just explain something that happened to me, and I'm just having a normal conversation with somebody, but they think that's really funny. And I'm like, you know what? That is funny. I will see if I can do a routine about that.
How do you decide which topics are off limits for you, if any? And how do you navigate sensitive subjects in your comedy?
Okay, so me personally, there are certain areas I will never touch. And I feel like as a comedian, you should really know what you are allowed to and not allowed to joke about. So I would never make a joke that is racist or homophobic or sexist or xenophobic or ableist. And I would never make jokes about tragedies. Like, I would never make a joke about 9/11 or, school shootings. I know a lot of people make jokes about that. They think, time plus tragedy equals comedy. I personally don't agree with that. I think, even though it's been so long since 9/11, you should still never make jokes about that. And also, I'm a believer of not making jokes about disabilities you don't have. I see that a lot where somebody is making a joke about a disability that they don't have. And that, I think, is a big no-no. If you have that disability and you are talking about your own experience, that is fine. So, for instance, I'm on the autism spectrum, so I make jokes about that, but I make it very clear I'm talking about my experience. I'm not making jokes about this in general. This is just how I experienced it in my school life, or etc. And I'm not dyslexic, for instance, so I would never make a joke about dyslexia. I struggled with speech issues, so I might make jokes about that, but I never stuttered, so I wouldn't make jokes about stutters. A lot of times I'll see comedians make jokes about disabilities they don't have, and I just don't think that's okay. So that's other stuff that I really pay attention to. And also, I am a straight cisgender white female, and I know that comes with a lot of privilege, and so I would never make jokes about people who don't have the same privileges that I do. And I mean, as a woman, I definitely can have experiences with sexism, sure. And so that, I think, is okay to joke about because I'm talking about my own experiences. But for instance, I would never make a joke about gays because I just don't think that's appropriate or funny. I also just don't think those jokes are funny. I don't think there's anything funny about making fun of people who are going through stuff that you will never experience.
Share with us one of the most memorable moments you've had on stage, whether it was a surprising audience reaction, an unexpected event, or a personal breakthrough.
Honestly, it was when I realized that I can turn my school struggles into material, because it's something that has been a big, obstacle for me for my entire life. And if you had asked me about that when I started doing stand up, I wouldn't have been comfortable talking about that. But I feel like stand up has also made me feel a lot more comfortable sharing personal stuff. And also, it gives you a unique voice, because I am talking about stuff that a lot of people probably haven't experienced. Like I talk about, certain things that happened in school that were challenging because of my struggles. And I feel like, those are kind of jokes that I feel like only me and anyone who else has experienced it can talk about. And I feel like when I started coming up with those material jokes, and those very unique to me material, and when I kind of realized, oh my god, all the stuff I've been venting about, all these things I had problems with my entire life, I can make a routine about that, and I could be very likable to an audience because I'm talking about something so unique. And I feel like that honestly just happened like this year in 2023. And I feel like that was kind of a notable, memorable breakthrough.
Have you ever had an interaction with a fan or audience member that deeply impacted you or changed the way you approach comedy?
Honestly, it's really when people come up to me after my set and just telling me I really loved this or that, or I really loved how you did this or that. And one time I auditioned for a show, and the booker gave me feedback, and they said that you have a very unique voice. And I was telling stories about, growing up in the autism spectrum and having all these learning challenges. And it was really then when I realized, yeah, I do have a unique voice and I really should utilize this more.
How do you feel about the current trends in stand-up comedy, especially with the rise of online platforms and social media influencing the comedic landscape?
I feel like social media can be a wonderful thing and also a very negative thing. Um, with the rise of Instagram Reels and TikTok, it is so easy to discover new comedians just through that. Like, I've discovered some comedians I've never heard of just from Instagram Reels. And also, personally, when there's a comedian that I really loved, I saw them perform and I'm like, wow, they're really funny. I immediately go to their Instagram or go to their TikTok because I want to see more of what they have. And that's just kind of the world we live in, where it's just very important for comedians to be on social media. On the flip side, when you are kind of putting your stuff out there for the whole world to see, you can get a lot of terrible comments, a lot of hateful comments, because you're a stranger to all these thousands or millions of viewers, and they will just say whatever they're thinking. They might not have a filter, and that I think can be a lot worse um, than bombing on stage. Because if you're bombing on stage, it's like, okay, only those people know that you didn't do well. But if you get really bad comments, and I don't mean like, oh, you stink or anything like that, but there are a lot of people that will make like very personal comments and will take personal digs, and And one time I posted a video on TikTok, and somebody actually just who I didn't know just commented, "Are you on the spectrum?" And even though yes, I am, it was still kind of like that's not something I would have just experienced 20 years ago. So yeah, I feel like social media could be a wonderful thing for comedians. It's great to be able to promote your stuff and get maybe more followers, get a bigger fan base, but can also have a lot of negative aspects as well.
There's been a lot of discussion about cancel culture and comedy. What's your perspective on the balance between pushing boundaries and being respectful?
Are you pushing boundaries at somebody else's expense? And I think that's really what it comes down to. Are the jokes you're making just hurting someone or hurting people? And I think that's really important distinction, because sure, pushing boundaries is fine, but depends on what you are joking about. Or is it just that you were a clean comic and now you're talking about sex? That's fine. It's a comedy style. If you are talking about something dark, are you insulting somebody by making those dark jokes? Because dark humor, I know there are a lot of comics who will push boundaries by trying to make really dark humor. And I think that can be okay depending on how you are telling the dark jokes. Like, are you really just making a whole group of people, or even just one person, the butt of the joke? If that's the case, that's not okay. But if you're just telling a joke where we're all just thinking, "Oh wow, can't believe they went there," that I think can be fine. It's all how you execute the jokes.
How do you see the future of stand-up comedy evolving, especially in a post-pandemic world where virtual shows have become more prominent?
I would love for virtual shows to be an option. I feel like they have kind of swindled down since things reopened. Now, a lot of clubs that used to just do virtual shows are now all in person. And frankly, that has been a good thing, but also a bad thing. Obviously, any stand-up comedian will probably agree that being on stage and getting the audience feedback is just so great and much better than doing Zoom. But I know, like, during the pandemic, I have done some virtual shows at a club in California. I live in New York. So that was just so convenient. I just hop on Zoom. Now they're all in person. They don't have any virtual shows anymore. And that's inconvenient because I can't just, hop on a plane to California just willy-nilly. Also, if you get sick and you can't perform in a big show, the option of being able to do it virtually can be so important, because now it's kind of like when you get sick and you can't perform it on stage. I feel like saying, why can't I just do this on Zoom? Another way that I think comedy has shifted is the importance of social media, because since the pandemic started, TikTok became a big thing, and basically anyone with an iPhone or a tablet can go viral. And I think that also was a big shift and continues in the post-pandemic world. But I do think, for the most part, in my experience at least, virtual shows haven't really been a thing as much. It sometimes happens, but for the most part, when clubs can just have in-person shows, that's what they want to do.
If you had to describe your comedic style in 3 words, what would they be and why?
Relatable, observational, personal. What I mean by that is the stuff I talk about are either just something that we all experience, but I'm adding my own perspective on it, so it's relatable and people can laugh at the jokes because they know what I'm talking about. They've been there, they've done that. Observational, because I might just point out something that I just noticed, and I've been told I kind of am like Jerry Seinfeld in that way. And then personal because, as I mentioned, a lot of stuff I talk about are from my personal experiences.
Who are some current comedians you admire or believe are pushing the boundaries of the art form?
So I've mentioned this before, but I really admire Taylor Tomlinson, and not just because of everything I've said before about her comedic style and how I just get so much inspiration just from watching how she does what she does, but also she's very young. We're literally the same age, and I just admire how far she's come at such a young age. And I admire her persistence, her dedication, and also her work ethic. And I also really admire just how respectful she is. You know, like I've never heard her tell one joke that I thought was not okay. She's so respectful, and I actually saw her perform a few weeks ago, and she would always ask someone that she is about to call on if they consent to crowd work. And if they said no, she would just move on to the next person. It was it was no big deal. But if they said yes, then she was always very respectful with the crowd work and never made anyone feel uncomfortable. And I really admired that. Because I know as an audience member, sometimes when you're called on and you're not planning on it or you didn't want to be called on, it can be very uncomfortable. So I just really think that's so important to respect the audience and only do crowd work with them if they are okay with it.
Comedy often serves as a reflection of society. How do you incorporate your personal experiences and observations about the world into your sets?
Well, I've kind of already explained this in a lot of detail in previous questions, but really, I just try to find the funny in situations. So, for instance, even if there's an experience I had that I didn't think was so funny, I might try to see, well, what could be funny about that? And maybe it's just a thought I had when that was happening. Or maybe it's just adding some sarcasm. For example, when I talk about my learning challenges, I talk about how I don't think I can ever do jury duty or be a doctor because of it. And I just make jokes about what that would look like. What would the operating room look like? What would the courtroom look like if I were there because of my challenges? And I think that's kind of how I take my personal experiences and observations is I just try to find it funny in it. I'm like, well, what could be funny about this? Or if there's something I've just ever thought of, like for a long time, I was terrified of being called for jury duty for that exact reason. And so I make jokes about that.
For aspiring comedians listening to this podcast, what piece of advice would you give them that you wish someone had given you when you were starting out?
I personally think having some coaching is so important because I have definitely taken a lot of amateur jokes I had to a whole new level with some coaching. I also feel like it's so easy for comedians starting out to immediately go for the big things, you know, immediately try to get to festivals or immediately try to get on a big show. And I feel like it's important to work up to that because all that's going to happen if you're not ready for those things is you're going to get disappointed and discouraged. So I definitely think that's really important. And also, a piece of advice I got recently was don't burn out your bringers. Bringer shows are big when you're starting off in comedy. Basically, you are given stage time, but you have to bring a certain amount of people. And you might think, oh, well, these are all really good shows. I'm going to make sure I have people to all of those. And I would say be selective because you don't want your friends or family that you're bringing to like be kind of not wanting to go to your shows anymore since they constantly have to pay an expensive ticket or constantly have to pay a drink minimum because you might really need bringers when it really mattered. You know, if you do a festival one day, having an audience on your side is really important because you might be judged by audience reaction. So I would say just be very selective about when you use your bringers.
Finally, what's next for you in your comedic journey? And where can our listeners catch your next performance?
New York City. I will be at the Stand on September 30th. I will be at West Side Comedy Club on October 7th. And I will be at Comic Strip Live on October 14th. And after that is TBD. I kind of take these things 1 month at a time.
I've been your host, Rob Chaffee. Don't forget to laugh today. It's good for you. Comedy Reset Spotlight is a podcast that brings you today's freshest and funniest comedy creators. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to hear more.